Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure of talking to you about one of the greatest organisms that's ever lived on the earth, and that is the giant sequoia tree. It's one of the largest, most iconic species on the planet Earth, and I feel fortunate to be able to talk about a few of the interesting facts, some of the adaptations that it has to survive, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to be able to bring up some particular interesting points about the giant sequoia. And the hope is that someday you might be motivated to go visit them. And they're found in California, and they're found in, of course, Sequoia National Park in California, and they're found in Yosemite National Park, in Calaveras Big Trees State Park. And so they're very rare. We just jump into this discussion, and they're certainly magnificent. And so they're commonly called the giant sequoia or just sequoia. Sometimes they're confused with their cousin, the coastal redwood tree, which is Sequoia sempervirens. This is Sequoiadendron giganteum. So they're in the same family along with another species of redwood called the dawn redwood. And so uh, obviously right from this picture, the get-go, you can see that they're enormous and they're magnificent. So let's get into some of this conversation. Um, they're known to be the largest trees in the world, and what we mean by that is they may not necessarily be the tallest, but ensure biomass. So they're rather bulky, and so they're considered to be the largest tree this way. They're tall and bulky in terms of diameter. So when I say largest tree, I could even throw out largest organism. Bigger than the largest dinosaur that ever walked the earth, larger than the biggest animal that is with us today, which is the blue whale. And they're as tall as a football field is long. And so this is a staggeringly huge organism. And so it's magnificent. And again, there's a concern because when you type in giant sequoia and you look at this at Wikipedia, it'll throw out something kind of interesting. It gives you whether or not we're concerned or whether or not the species is extinct. But as you can see here, that it's endangered. And so this calls us to pay attention to it and to maybe learn historically why the numbers are so low, and then therefore we can maybe do something preventative and really help them get their foot back into the ground. So you could see here in this map of California, they're located on sort of the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, a little bit of high altitude, and they're very rare. And here you can look at the classification scheme all the way down. So Sequoiadendron and then giganteum is a species. So one of their concerns is that being so huge and so powerful, they're so sensitive as well. And so their seeds are very, very small. They sort of look like oatmeal. And in order for the seeds to grow successfully, they need really rich mineral soil. Now, I know you might be thinking, doesn't every seed require rich mineral soil? Of course, they would prefer that, but the sequoia really needs it. And one of the problems is not only do they need this, but they need full sunlight, the seeds, in order to germinate, free from competitive vegetation. And so this is one of the problems, because when we go into a grove of giant sequoia trees, look how big they are, but along next to them is a lot of different species of trees that have been growing up over the years. Like these are cedar trees that are growing around. And so there's a lot of small trees growing next to the big tree, and therefore shading out the babies of the big tree. And so I hope a question comes into mind, well, if this is the case, how did that happen? Where were these small trees? Has this always been the case? Well, I think you might be able to predict what's going on here. And so humans have long been, there's an association with fire that humans have had, and so we've obviously not enjoyed fire. It's very dangerous. It could destroy our homes and our development. It could actually endanger lives. But we also, because the fact we love these sequoia groves, we've been suppressing fire for approximately 100 years now. For the last century, we've not allowed fires to burn through sequoia forests. And why? Because we were trying to do a good thing. We were trying to not to have these trees be burned down. But the truth is, we've discovered, and a lot of this research comes out of the University of California, Berkeley, we've discovered that periodic wildfires have often come through these groves of giant sequoia trees. And we know that from looking at fire scars on the side of the trees, but more importantly, we could look at rings and notice that there's some scarring going on. And what we believe occurred is that when these fires go through, they clear out competitive vegetation. And all of those sort of shade-tolerant trees like cedar and all these other trees that are competitive are eliminated. And so, as it turns out, like when those trees are eliminated, like for example, if you remove these cedar trees because a fire comes by, the giant sequoia tree will be able to grow because it has more direct sunlight. And in addition to that, what happens is that the fire that passes through provides hot air because the hot air rises through convection. And as it goes up, these are the female sequoia cones. What will happen is it'll dry up the cones and it'll allow for the seeds to be released from the cones. And so that corresponds directly to the fact that the fire just went by. And what happens is not only are these competitive smaller trees burned down, but the nutrients that were in those trees make the soil more rich in mineral. And so you've eliminated the competition from blocking the sun, and you've enriched the soil. These are the perfect conditions for new sequoia trees to grow. So what I'm getting at is, you ready for this? Sequoia trees require fire in order to reproduce. And humans, just cutting right to the chase, humans, because we were trying to do the right thing, have been suppressing fire. And in the end, we've been diminishing the redwood's ability to reproduce. Isn't that ironic? And so here's a baby redwood tree growing, and as it turns out that the seed, this is a seedling, the seed itself is actually sensitive to direct ultraviolet damage. And so some scientists think that even the ash from the fire alone is protective. And so that's critical. And then do you notice how these cones over here, and there's a lot of like floor litter, like these little needles from pine trees and cedar and all this. This is what we kind of loosely call duff. And this prevents, when the seeds come raining down, this prevents the seed from actually reaching mineral soil. It's not going to be able to germinate if it's sitting on top of all these twigs. So again, the fire comes in sort of like a vacuum cleaner, comes in and just burns it all up, and then you actually have fertile mineral soil for the seed to be able to land and germinate. And so because of fire suppression over the last 100 years, fires won't be burning low intensity anymore. Because what I mean by that is what do you mean, like low intensity fire, high intensity fire? What I mean by that is maybe I can even illustrate this. Let me try it. When a fire comes by and there's not a lot of vegetation, the fire will just burn like this, kind of low, like it's a low going fire. But when you've been suppressing fire for a long time, there's a lot more smaller trees, and so there's a lot more fuel. So the fire gets really, really intense. And as it turns out, when the forest is burning this intense, it can actually endanger the redwood tree. Now the redwood tree is adapted because its foliage is what you would call like a crown foliage, meaning that like if I were to draw the redwood tree over here on the side, like this, its vegetation is really high up like this. And so a normal fire, when I say low fire, it's not going to be able to endanger the redwood tree. For one thing, the bark is extremely thick and the needles aren't going to get burned. But as it turns out, if you have these cedar trees next to it, I'm blaming the cedar tree, but the cedar tree is a beautiful tree, but just saying, when the fire comes by and it burns this, it gets hot enough to where it might catch the entire forest on fire and destroy everything, and you don't want that. And then sometimes a tree, when these smaller trees are in there, sometimes they'll burn down and they'll sort of roll, like the burning log will burn next to a giant sequoia, and it'll just keep burning and burning and burning, and it'll actually will penetrate the bark. And so fire suppression has led to this sort of buildup of dense fire sensitive incense cedar and white fir, and so those are going to burn and therefore endanger the giant sequoia. So the idea is that fire is needed to get these trees growing, but now there's so much clutter and there's so many trees in the sequoia forest, we can't allow fire. We actually have to stop the fire or else it'll burn the whole thing down. So in addition to fire, another interesting association with redwood trees is that these carpenter ants, here's a picture of them, the fire keeps these things in check. It's like, believe it or not, a little tiny ant, but they don't work alone. They're in a colony. These ants can actually do some damage to the giant sequoia. They keep gnawing at it, and actually can possibly damage a redwood tree. And so fire actually burns these guys and takes them out of the equation. And so, as it turns out, I know it sounds like a long time ago, but evidence needed to be collected, and we really needed to study the whole interaction between forest fires and tree reproduction. But now the National Park Service, it started getting the data in around the 1970s, and now the Park Service is responding to this. And so now we have these things called controlled burns. Now it's easier said than done. Controlled burn means that the ranger and Park Service go out there and they actually try to start fires deliberately. And they try to start it after maybe a rainfall so it doesn't get out of hand. They have to make sure that it's not windy on a particular day, that there's high humidity. There's a lot involved. It's very strategic. But if they can get some small fires going, you can burn off a lot of these smaller trees and fallen logs to try to restore the park into its natural state that it was once in. And so controlled burns is sort of managing the forest. And so the hope is someday when a naturally occurring fire starts, like from lightning, we will allow it to burn. But right now we have to actually not allow it to burn because of the conditions as they are. So in addition to fire, there's a couple in those carpenter ants, which are kind of negative. There's a couple of associations that are really good for redwood trees. So these beetles, as it turns out, the longhorn beetle, look how long the horns are. What they do is these beetles will come along and they'll actually lay their eggs, which are really small, in the cone. And then when those eggs grow up into larvae, the larva starts to bore holes into the cone. And you're like, well, what? That doesn't sound too good. And as it turns out, when the larva is like eating through the cone, what it does is it sort of cuts off their circulation to the cone, the water, and therefore it dries them. And then in a couple of months, what will happen is the seeds, you can see them here, when the beetles have gotten to these cones, it's more likely that the seeds will be able to be released from the cone, and it'll help the trees to actually reproduce. Incredible. So the cones that are really high up need to be dried by the fire, and then they need to be sort of attacked by the beetles for them to open up. And if you also this is great. This is a close-up here of the size that we're talking about. Look at this. Look how small. It's like oatmeal. From such a small seed comes the largest living thing on the planet Earth. I mean, there's something motivating there. And so, do you remember this association? So we got these longhorn beetles that are really helping out, and then we have this Douglas squirrel, sometimes called the chicory. The chicory comes along and is sort of gnawing at the young cones, the ones that are green and fleshy, but they don't seem to eat the seeds so much. And so what that does is when they gnaw on this, that further helps to release the seeds and help them to be dislodged. And so therefore that helps them to reproduce. How about that? So little Douglas squirrels and little beetles are helping out the giant sequoia. Isn't that cool? And so as it turns out, why are the trees in danger? Well, they're in danger because of humans are not just fire, but humans are logging these trees, because think about it. So much lumber can be obtained from cutting one of these trees down. But fortunately, this is one of the saving graces of the giant sequoia, is that the wood isn't quite as good. It's not as desirable as its cousin, the coastal redwood. Everyone loves the coastal redwood lumber. It's just absolutely fabulous for building homes and decks and all of this. But the giant sequoia, interestingly enough, its wood is somewhat fibrous and brittle, and it doesn't work perfectly for construction, and that's a good thing, because though it didn't stop lumberjacks from harvesting the trees, because they're so huge that if you were to just cut down a big one, you could make like 40 houses out of it. So it's very tempting. This is a really sad photograph. I thought I'd include myself in it, indulge myself. This is a stump of a giant tree, and it took me a little bit of an effort to climb up on this, but this is what we're talking about. These are huge. And this is at Sequoia National Park, and I had asked the ranger where this location was, where all this logging was taking place, and I drove down this road, and it was really, really sad. I stopped here, and it was a moment looking out at, it was basically like looking out at a cemetery of these tree stumps. It was absolutely brutal to see the destruction. And, I don't want to get too liberal about this and too environmental about logging, because we all live in homes that require wood, and we need paper, and we need all of these products, but there's really it's not sustainable to be able to pick on these giant sequoia trees. They're very rare, and though they're majestic, and it just isn't appropriate to choose this particular tree. This is what I'm trying to get at. And so from the 1800s to the 1920s, a lot of logging took place, despite the sort of marginal commercial return of the brittleness of the tree. And so one of the issues that the lumberjacks had, as I mentioned, is when the tree would fall, it would shatter, and it wouldn't make for really nice, clean lumber for construction. And so in order to prevent the tree from splitting and cracking up into small pieces, they would stop at nothing. They would actually dig these big trenches. This isn't an actual photograph of it, but it's something like it. They dig these big trenches, and they'd fill it up with branches so that when the big tree would fall, it wouldn't break up so much, but it would still break up. And even if you had some good wood, it was still worth it to cut down these big trees. And so I pulled this picture out from the past, and it really saddens me. It's like it shows the people like almost celebrating and dancing on the tree, like they've like conquered some great thing that they've achieved. It's like holding up a big fish or something like this. It's really saddens me, and I think society has sort of changed and evolved, and I think we see things differently. At least I do. When I see a stump, it brings a tear to my eye, literally. It's not something to stand on and dance on and make mockery of. And so I just wanted to show you this, the stump and trunk of the mammoth tree of Calaveras. Yeah, if it's a mammoth tree, you don't want to cut it down, it seems. And then I wanted to bring up this point, is that, if not all the wood could be used, because it's fragmented and it's broken up, what was the scraps used for? Well, the wood from a giant sequoia tree was used for shingles on homes or fence posts. They were even used as matchsticks. Can you believe this? And so you're like, this is disgrace. This is like humiliating for some of these majestic trees, some of the greatest things that have ever lived on the earth, to be reduced to a fence post. And so it was these kinds of uses of the sequoia wood that actually spurred the public outcry. People were like just outraged by the fact that the sequoia could be reduced to something so menial as to be a fence post. And so this is what ignited the public against the massive logging, and therefore a lot of the groves then became preserved and protected with the help of fabulous organizations like Save the Redwoods League and the Sempervirens Club, and also the National Park Service. And so now a lot of these sequoia groves are protected. They're in Sequoia National Park, they're in Yosemite National Park, and so they're protected as far as from lumber, not necessarily protected from disease or protected from climate change, but they're protected. So now they're restricted to about 75 different groves. Groves are just areas where certain small populations of them are able to grow. Why just here? That's a big question. I'm not sure if I can really even answer it, why they're restricted to this. I could say one thing, that since it's on the western slope, it does get a lot more precipitation and a lot more runoff. And these trees really require a lot of water. Typically, they live next to creeks or a little river or stream. They really require a tremendous amount of water. But why they're located specifically where they were is somewhat of a mystery. I've been told that John Muir was really intrigued by that question, and he wondered whether or not the sequoia had a larger range many years ago, but he was not able to really answer that question. So as it turns out, it's not impossible for the trees to reproduce. This is actually this tree right here is a giant sequoia. It's kind of a teenager, and so they're capable of growing, but it's just that the mature forest needs to be intact, because, not to go too far with this, but the trees are part of a community, and it takes literally hundreds of years to establish the relationships that these trees have with other trees and the animals, as I was alluding to earlier. And so you just can't harvest them down and then plant seeds and grow them. It takes literally a long time for them to develop, so you don't really want to cut them down. And so, as it turns out, one of the unique things about these giant sequoias, other than their size, is that their ability to reproduce, even when they're really, really old, they can still continue to reproduce, which is really cool. They reproduce with their cones sexually. So the males produce, the male cone produces pollen, and the pollen is transferred by the wind, and it goes over and it fertilizes the egg, and then those seeds are produced, and then the seeds come out. And so each cone has about 200 seeds, so there's a lot of potential there. And so what's interesting is that the baby trees, when they're growing, they don't grow so fast in the beginning. Perhaps it's because they lack the sunlight, or maybe there's not enough moisture. It's hard to know. But once they start getting going, they can really start growing quickly, and they can live for a long time. When I say a long time, look at this. The greatest known age of the giant sequoia redwood is 3,200 years. 3,200 years. And we don't even know if that's the case. I mean, we're counting these rings and we're getting an estimate. We could do carbon dating, but sometimes they don't lay down the rings, the annual rings. They go into a period of dormancy when there's a drought. And so we really don't even know the oldest tree. It's incredible. But we do know that some of the ones that are even alive today are thousands of years old. So these are really, really special. And so, you could look at this from a distance. It really takes your breath away. And you can be like, oh, here's the crown foliage. And you're like, wait a minute. Those younger trees had branches. What's up with that? Like, what did these branches? Well, maybe they died because of the shading from the upper branches. And so you don't see the trunk having... And so that's a great adaptation for fire as well. And so what about their root system? As it turns out, something that this tall, you might expect the root system to go equally deep into the soil. But as it turns out, let me animate it from this picture. As it turns out, the root system doesn't grow very deep, but rather it grows about 12 feet or so, maybe 15 feet below the ground, but it grows really, really far out laterally. Now, this is a great adaptation for obtaining as much water as you possibly can from the rain. And so this is very good. And it also helps, if I draw on another tree, it also helps this tree stand up to wind. I mean, I know they're big, but they can be toppled over by snow and wind. And so if these roots from one tree interlock with another one, there's strength this way. And so the strength of the tree is the forest. So that's an important adaptation. So they have these lateral roots that facilitate survival in dry summers. They can go out so far that they can maybe get creeks and streams from all over the place. And so, because of their thick bark, they're adapted to fire, and so it's gonna take a lot to burn through the bark. And so, how thick is it? Well, fire has gone through, but it can't kill the tree. It can actually burn the side of the bark, but the bark will grow back. It's like, well, how thick is the bark? The bark could be about a foot thick. That's incredible. That's a very, very thick. And so not only is it difficult to penetrate when a fire comes by, that the wood itself is fire resistant. There's a chemical called tannic acid that gives it this red color. That's why the tree is reddish in coloration. And we use this now in fire extinguishers to put out fire. But its bark it's resistant to fire. You can't even ignite it. If you had a match and you tried to burn the bark, you wouldn't be able to do it. And it's also resistant. This acidity resists a lot of fungi and a lot of mold, a lot of pathogens that would normally sometimes bother a tree. They don't bother the redwood tree. So it's really an impressive thing. They can die, but usually when they die, they're toppled over because of the fact that maybe there was a drought for many, many years, or maybe there was too much water happening and the soil became too soft and it toppled over, or maybe snow leaned it up along the side of it and toppled it over. So just to sort of summarize, the biggest human impact has been logging, but number two, it's been fire exclusion, and we can do something about both of these. We can come in with controlled burns and get rid of this fuel that's endangering the trees, and it's difficult. You can talk about this and watch a video about it, but look at these. Look at the Park Service. It's brutal out here. It's like you're actually starting fires on purpose to prevent catastrophic fires from occurring, all because we're trying to save the redwoods. And I think it's extremely noble. And I hope someday you're motivated enough to actually not just study the redwood trees, and there's many ways to help them. You could study their genetics, and we do that. But then there's just getting up and going outside and actually dealing. And not all of us are cut out for this kind of hard work, but whatever it takes to preserve these trees are important. So agencies that are responsible for managing the grove have different policies in place to sort of reintroduce fire into the ecosystem, as I was mentioning before. And so someday we'll be able to look back, and our children will be able to look back, and their children will be able to look back on some of the things that we did today, and they'll learn how through our mistakes we were able to change our way and to be able to motivate and to not do the same thing wrong every time. There's great hope. That's the thing, that humans are capable of having such potential for good. I know we can make mistakes, but it's how we respond and how we react. It's like we can fall down, but we can rise. So I hope together, collectively, we'll be able to protect, preserve these great organisms, these giant sequoias, for the end of time. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video on giant sequoia. Thanks.